Hi, welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, bridging the generation gap by debunking some myths, tackling stereotypes, and hopefully giving you some practical tips on how you can build stronger intergenerational connections and relationships. I've got a series of fascinating guests who are going to be coming on the show with me, bringing their own unique perspective. And our guest today, well, what a guest. He's called Paul Carter. You will recognise him from BBC. He's, when it comes to tech, Paul is the man. He's the lead presenter on Click that you might have seen. So we are going to be talking a lot about technology today. He's also featured on World's Greatest Train Journeys, and he's also on Tech Explorer. He's whizzing around the world all the time, going to tech shows. And in fact, we're catching him, I think, in between going to different ones in Vegas, Tokyo, and everywhere else. Also, what's really interesting about Paul and where we first met at a great charity called Reach, Paul is passionate about assistive and adaptive technologies because Paul was born without lower arms or legs. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well and about how that environment has changed through the generation. So first of all, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
We've got a lot to talk about. And the first thing really, I want to talk a little bit about you. First of all, what's your generation and do you identify with the generation that you were born into?
No, I probably don't. I think I've always probably been on the younger end of my scale. I mean, I was born in 1980, so I'm not even sure what generation that makes me. Yeah, no, I've always.
Well, you're actually a cusper. You're a cusper between. You're a cusper. There you go. You haven't heard of that one. A cusper is basically where you're born literally right on the edge between two generations. So you're between Gen X and Millennial Gen Y. So you can choose which one you want to be a part of. I guess it's Millennial.
Yeah, I suppose so. Although you know, the Millennials aren't exactly non-maligned, are they? So maybe I'll stick to being a cusper. I quite enjoy that. Then I can have the best of both worlds, can't I?
Well, I think millennials have been overtaken by Gen Z if it comes to where people start making comments about them and things. It is quite interesting how people who are millennials don't actually think about, they forget 12 years ago when they were the group coming into the workplace, how everyone was talking about them. But of course, things have changed. In your big world of tech, things have changed. But first of all, tell us a little bit about your upbringing, and specifically when we talk about limb difference, how that was very different for you growing up versus maybe children of today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me. I mean, you know, I've got my my parents to thank for quite a lot. So as you say, I was born without lower arms or legs, and you know, it was the 80s, and a lot of the trend then was to send disabled kids to what we would call then special school. And you know, my parents, my mum in particular, kind of railed against that quite strongly, and and thanks to her, I spent my entire school life, well, mostly in mainstream education. I went to a school for disabled children until I was about 7 years old, and then got moved into mainstream education, and that really kind of opened a lot of doors for me, and I think it's probably made me the person I am today. But you know, in terms of my relationship with technology, it meant that I was exposed to kind of, you know, a lot of assistive technology and stuff at a very early age, and even stuff that you maybe wouldn't even consider sort of assistive technology. But my school were quite forward thinking, and that I was introduced to computers quite young, and I was given typing lessons, I should say, very early. So, you know, I was sort of exposed to that side of technology very, very early, and I think again that's probably set me in good stead for the rest of my life, really.
And there's a couple of interesting things there, because obviously one of my passions is to make environments more generationally inclusive. But I do a bit of work in schools, and what I see is how much more inclusive schools are when it comes to ability, when it comes to all sorts of differences. And that's a massive difference from when you were at school. I can imagine you were probably the exception to the rule in those days.
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky in that the school that I went to was, like I say, it was a mainstream comprehensive, but it had a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it. I mean, a unit, a department that was set up for pupils with extra needs, with disabilities. And so, we had things like support workers in class and things like that, but that was absolutely a rarity. Not every school had that. I think it was probably the only school in the town that I'm from, that had that at the time. So, it's one of those things, isn't it? You roll the lottery dice of life. It's like if I'd been born somewhere else, then maybe I wouldn't have even have had that opportunity open to me. So but I do think it's kind of shaped a lot of what I've gone on to do since, I think.
One of the things which I think is really interesting is people often look at younger generations and the word resilience comes up a huge amount. And one of the things we were talking about before we recorded this was that, my experience of going into schools and working with the charity Reach, which is a phenomenal charity for children and adults born with upper limb differences. And one of the things that I see is the level of resilience amongst those youngsters in particular. Is that something that you think has helped you in your life?
1,000,000%. I mean, I always say to everyone, disabled people, we are inherent born problem solvers. And I think that does lead itself to a sense of resilience because, I don't want to sort of over-labor the point, but, you face kind of challenges every day. I mean, sometimes, most of the time, they're very, very, very minor things. How do I open this jar, or how do I reach that thing off the shelf in the supermarket or whatever? So I think you do sort of inherently develop that sort of sense of resilience, and I think that's kind of massively played into it. But I don't know how much of that is a generational thing, or whether how much of that is a personal thing. It's always kind of really hard to identify those sort of traits precisely. But I do think sort of my impairment and my life experiences have sort of contributed to that resilience 100%. Yeah.
Just before we go on to the technology side, because it's a very exciting time. We've got Gen Beta being born in 2025. Technology is evolving at just a phenomenal rate. So given that, just before we get to that, I just want to talk a little bit about the generational differences for people, that we get to see at the Reach weekends and so on. What differences are you seeing between younger children with limb differences versus those who are older, who were born in a different generation?
I think social media is probably a really huge thing. I mean, I know it's obviously a huge thing for all younger people, regardless of whether they're disabled or not. But I think where it's been really interesting is exposure, because when I was growing up, you didn't really, apart from the people that you were physically around, you never saw other people like you. I never saw anyone like me on television. I mean, we didn't have the internet when I was younger, but we didn't see anyone else doing anything. Whereas I think kids today, with the influencer generation and social media, you can see people like you, and you can see people that are out there having successful careers or doing really amazing stuff. And I think that's probably one of the biggest differences I can imagine that didn't exist when I was younger.
Well, certainly, your work with the BBC, what you're doing is something that probably wouldn't have happened 10, 20, certainly not 30, 40 years ago. So, that's brilliant. And actually talking about the tech side, said here, in a fairly feeble segue, but getting to that, you go to all these tech shows, you see lots of things. I know you're particularly interested in areas of ability, but how do you keep up with all of that? And then also, what about older people that, struggle with technology as is, and it's changing all the time?
Yeah, I mean, two interesting questions there. I mean, how do I keep up with it all? I mean, I guess the answer is I don't, and even I don't. It's tough because it's it's part of why I think the tech beat is the best one to work on, because you're just deluged with new stuff every single day. Quite literally, it's hard to keep track. But I mean, I think if I was to sort of give any advice in terms of how perhaps people of a different generation keep across it, it's just being aware of it's having a filter really, and just being aware of what's actually going to be impacting on your life, in particular your day-to-day experiences, because as I'm sure we're all aware, that the tech industry as a whole is a hype machine, and you hear lots of hyperbole about lots of things about what's going to change the world, when in reality, a lot of it won't, or if it does, it will happen in 10, 20, 30 years time. So I would say, maybe just sort of have a slightly critical eye and cut through the hype and see, well, what's actually coming, today, tomorrow, next week, next month. That's probably a way to stop you from going a little bit crazy about it all, I'd say.
You probably remember a TV show, Tomorrow's World, and I always remember the one with the and for younger listeners and viewers, you'll probably have to go back and watch this on YouTube or something, but watch the one where, do you remember with the CD where they covered it with jam and said it'll still play, it'll be marvellous, and it still took us quite some time before we got CDs. There does seem to be this lag between what we hear about and then before it becomes mainstream.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's really that's really key to sort of, I think if you were to go out and read all of the tech publications today, you'd think we were living in sort of some episode of the Jetsons next week. And as you say, it's not really like that. I just realised I'm really showing my age by referencing the Jetsons, but but yeah,
that's okay. You're a cusper. You're allowed to do that.
Where we are today is, in some respects, a huge gulf away from where we were 20 years ago. But at the same time, if you ask people 20 years ago where they thought we'd be today, they'd probably think it would all be flying cars and, food coming out of machines and stuff. And we're not really there yet. So I think that, as you say, that the pace at which it trickles down to ordinary folk like us is probably slower than we're led to believe. Yeah.
Well, I think you probably get access to it earlier than others, but I do remember the anniversary of Back to the Future when they did 2015 and what actually came true and what didn't. And it was quite interesting what had and what hadn't. And the one thing that they hadn't thought about was mobile phones. They'd thought about all sorts of other things, but not that. I want to get to Gen Beta because a lot of people listening might think, well, what's that got to do with me in the workplace? Gen Beta. Well, of course, they will be coming into the workplace in 20 years' time. Meanwhile, you've got Gen Alpha, who are now sort of 13. They're going to be coming into the workplace in literally just 5 years or more time. What are the sort of things that you think, and this is really putting you on the spot, but as a tech expert who understands you've seen the impact of social media and tech on youngsters, what are the kind of things that you think we might be looking at in 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 years' time, if you dare be that brave?
I was going to say, you are putting me on the spot. I'll get my crystal ball out. I think and this does have an impact on, if we're talking about the workplace. I think the biggest area we are going to see tech have an impact on stuff is automation, and I don't necessarily mean in kind of industry and that kind of automation. I think the automation of things that we currently have people to do. We're seeing the sort of explosion, the early explosion of AI at the moment. And I think that the problem with that is that we've got a phenomenal solution, but we've not yet found a problem for it to solve. And I think that the thing that's going to really crack that is going to be, do this task for me, and it will do it. I'm seeing bits of it in. As you mentioned at the top, I travel to Japan quite a lot, and a lot of the hotels in Japan now have robots working in them. If you want water or towels sent to your room, you press a button in your room, and then next thing you know, there's a ring at the door, and you open it, and there's a little robot there, and you open the lid and take the stuff out, and it trundles back to the lift, and it calls itself the thing in the lift, and it goes back down again. That's a really kind of sort of almost a little sort of fun example, but I think going forward, those sorts of tasks are going to be automated a lot more, which is going to have big implications for the workplace, I think. So that kind of sort of combination of AI, robotics, and automation is probably where I think we genuinely are going to see a generational change in kind of how we live our lives.
Do you believe in the adage that I heard about, that today's generation, today's school children, so probably Gen Alpha, that they will probably have 5 careers in their life, but 3 of them haven't been invented yet because of technology. Would you be an advocate of that kind of statement?
I mean, I certainly don't. I certainly don't disagree with it. I think that's absolutely true. And without getting too sort of socio-political history about it, I think what we're going to see now, in effect, is in the next sort of 20 or 30 years, maybe longer, is equivalent to what we had in kind of the Industrial Revolution, really, where it is going to be different, and a lot of what we would consider traditional types of jobs might phase out. They might change, but as you say, there are going to be a whole swathe of new ones that we don't even know about yet that are going to come along and come around the corner. Your average sort of Victorian serf didn't know that there was going to be such a thing as software engineers. So I mean, I think that kind of change, I think, is something that we're going to see a lot of. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely true. Yeah.
Well, I come from a farming background, as you know, and when I look at a tractor today compared to the old bangers that we had on our farms back in the 70s, it was, I mean, I wouldn't even know what to do. Probably wouldn't even know how to turn it on. But that's a whole different thing. Let's talk about the workplace, and let's share a few gems and tips and things about how people can help. One of the things that we hear a lot about is reverse mentoring, or what is now more appropriately called mutual mentoring. And when it comes to tech, that's something that can be really beneficial. What have you seen in that area?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I've done some reverse mentoring more generally, not about technology specifically, but I think I think where it's useful is just with a lot of this stuff, it's just sort of conquering the fear of the unknown and showing that it's think if you're coming to technology new, or a specific type of technology, it's perfectly natural and human to think that there's going to be this extraordinary learning curve involved, and to almost sort of think like that at the time to commit to even learning that, and then second to that, even if I do, what are the benefits of it to me? So I think maybe having that experience of someone, being able to sort of introduce you to those kind of things and eliminate a little bit of those preconceptions, I think is probably something that's really quite valuable. Yeah.
And one of the things I think it's always interesting is that every generation can learn from each other. The young can learn from the old can learn from the young. Let's just play a little bit of a game here, where give us one thing that you think the young could really benefit from listening to the old, and then the old could benefit from listening to the young. There's putting you on the spot.
I think listening is a key point. You use that word there. I'm not sure young people listen enough these days. So I think that's important. I think one thing I would say that I do slightly worry that we slightly lose on the younger generation slightly with the advent of AI, and something that I think might actually accelerate as things like ChatGPT and things become more commonplace, is that ability of critical thinking. And I'm in a strange position with AI because, I'm a tech evangelist. I love technology, but I am also slightly cautious, particularly around things like generative AI, because I'm very much of a mindset and a generation that I don't trust AI to write anything for me, because I would then want to completely read it word for word afterwards to make sure it's said what I wanted it to say. Whereas I think you've got a whole generation of people coming that are growing up with AI that are just going to say, write me an email to my boss that sounds professional, and off it goes. And I think we're losing that sense of kind of critical thinking and sort of self-analysis a little bit, which I think maybe older generations still hold quite dearly. So I'd say if we're looking at it in that direction, that's probably the thing I'm most interested in at the moment. I don't know if that answers your question.
And,
sorry.
You've been Yeah, no, that's great. No, I mean, this is an interview. It's more of a chat, but it's just interesting to hear the different perspectives, because we tend to be quite siloed in our thinking sometimes. We see things through our own lens, and we don't look beyond and think. And, we get to a point where we think we know it all because we're older, and then young people, it was ever so, wasn't it, that young people always knew best. They always had all the answers. We were exactly the same when we were that age. I mean, in that respect, I guess nothing really changes.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I thought I ruled the world when I was 15. You think you know everything, don't you? And that's I don't think that's ever going to change. I mean, but I think what has changed slightly is that when I was 15, the internet was only just a couple of years old. Kids today, younger people have the all of the information they could ever wish to have at their fingertips, and I think what's interesting is not just having that information, but new ways of accessing it and deploying that information, which is both, I think, really exciting and fascinating and scary at the same time. But yeah, I think we can all learn from each other, and I think it's really, really important to keep having those conversations and to have those bridges and those connections. I think it's massively important, because I don't think you can necessarily wall one generation off from another. You described me as a cusper, and I know I was joking when I say I can sort of take the best parts of both, but I think that's hugely important, that we don't just put ourselves in one box and say, well, this is my lived experience, and that's the only thing I'm interested in learning from or contributing to.
And also, as listeners and viewers will be fed up hearing from me, we're framed by our generation, not defined by it. So therefore, it's not as linear as it might seem. One of the things that I'm interested in as well is bigger organizations, because smaller organizations, it's sometimes easier to keep in touch with people, build those connections, build those relationships, because there aren't actually going to be that many people from different generations. So you kind of have to all get together. You're working at the BBC, and without giving away any corporate secrets, and I'm going to be positive and say, what are some of the things that they are doing right when it comes to intergenerational communication that maybe other people could learn from? What are you seeing in maybe the way they work with you, the way they work with different generations, that you think actually that's a really positive thing?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, like you say, with big organisations, it is difficult generally, sort of keeping in touch. But my organisation are trying lots of new things at the moment, and I think particularly post-pandemic, when you've got people working in different places and working in a different way, I guess. We're not all in the office 9 to 5 Monday to Friday anymore, so I think lots of different ways. Organising sessions for people to get together in person when you can is I think still important. But again, understanding that not everyone is able to do that for a variety of reasons. I think we're doing regular kind of video sessions. These, I think they're calling them coffee and croissant meets once a month, where you can, even if you're not able to join in person, you can join remotely and buy a coffee, and you can get reimbursed for the cost of whatever that costs you, so you can still keep in touch for like a social type gathering that's not necessarily just talking about work. I think those kinds of things are very important. But I think also, continuing kind of the tech theme, that the explosion since the pandemic of remote working technology. So, things like Slack, Microsoft Teams, Discord, all those kinds of things that are enabling people to get together, that you can set up little subgroups and things like that. I think they're all very important as well, but it's a hybrid, and I think people are still grappling with it. I think all organizations are still grappling with it as to how you solve that problem of what used to be just once every 2 months we all get together and have a coffee and have a chat in a room. When the world's changed, how do we do that? I think everyone's still grappling with that, but I think tech's got a big part to play in that.
It's really interesting. It's interesting you say that, because one of the things that this misconception that Gen Z don't want to come into the office, they don't want to be there, where our research that we did last year, plus numerous other research studies, have all come to the same conclusion. Actually, Gen Z do want to come into the office. Is that what you're seeing at the
Yeah,
Beeb?
absolutely. I think that particularly in the industry I work in, that's a creative industry. You create best when you're with other people. But whole part of the creative process is sharing ideas and experiences and bouncing all that around, and that's so much harder to do over a platform, if I can use that word. That's not to say it's impossible, but it's not as natural. So yeah, I think absolutely people want to come back. I think people want to come back perhaps slightly more on their own terms. I think that whole flexibility, I think, is the key thing. I think people want flexibility, and again, that's an issue that lots of people are still grappling with.
Gen Z are happy to speak. Gen Z are happy to speak up about it, where maybe previous generations weren't happy to speak up about it, and that might be like a key difference.
I think that's totally right. Yeah, and and I'm seeing it with lots of younger generational people that I work with that are very, very bold to simply say, I'm not feeling well today, I'm not coming in, or I'm going to be working from home tomorrow. And it's that sort of slight shift from almost like not asking permission or being ashamed to ask for permission. It's almost just like, this is what I need to be at my best productively. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I think that's a very definite change. Yeah.
And we all have to get used to it, because it probably isn't going to change.
Don't think it is. I think, if I can use a cliche, the genie's, I think, very much out of the bottle.
It is indeed. We've only got a couple more minutes. That went, usually, as always, very, very fast. I really want to just do a little bit of a recap of some of the things that you feel when it comes to technology, and feel free to talk about ability as well, that different generations can learn from each other, so that people, going away from listening to this podcast can think, there's something that I really need to probably think about a little bit more. Give us a couple of things that you think generationally in your world that we could all learn from.
I think I think particularly with social media, right? I think there's become a lot of demonization of it in the media and in society more generally, and I think understandably for a lot of reasons, because there are lots of faults and lots of problems with it. But I think what we've slightly lost, and I worry slightly that kind of parents and grandparents are going to think that social media is entirely kind of evil and bad for you and all of these things. And I think, I have achieved so much in my life thanks to connections I've made and experience I've had purely through social media and, meeting other people and learning new things and discovering opportunities. So I really, really hope that we're able to hold on to that, and that, we realize that when it's used well and used for good, I think, social media is hugely beneficial in some senses, with caveats and with guardrails and with all of those protections in place, but that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and just, come down on it with an iron fist and say it's bad and I don't want my children using it, or I don't want younger people using it, because it has a lot to offer. So I think that would probably be the biggest thing for me. And then, but also, if we're looking at it from the other way, I think, we're of an age now where, like you say, I think that, the younger people that are coming into the workplace now, they're probably the first generation where their parents did grow up with the internet and did grow up with kind of what we would call modern technology and stuff. So I think, maybe realizing that I'm probably banging on a locked door here, but you don't actually know it all.
Well, you know what? I think that's a perfect ending to the podcast, actually. It's admitting none of us know it all. And the sooner we realise that, the better. But we can all learn from each other, and we can learn different things. And it's really interesting about social media, because you're absolutely right. Like everything, there's good and bad in everything. And it's just a shame that sometimes the legal framework is somewhat behind the curve, trying to catch up with technology. And I think that's possibly a conversation for another day. You know, how can we do that more? But Paul, it's been great to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and to give us your unique perspective. Enjoy your next train journey, wherever you go next, and all your jet setting around the world, looking at technology. And I look forward to you coming to the next podcast on the flying saucer.
So do I. Thanks ever so much, Alastair.